Open to-do layout file. Now we will create a task component. So go ahead and create task node under the children node. The task node item comes after the to-do node. Create component node. Specify the task component. Now go ahead and create task component. Use abstract component as dependency from same directory. Here dot and / operator means we are taking the component from same directory. Extend from the abstract component. Specify the templates under default object. And then specify the task template path. Now go ahead and create task template file. Create a div with ID view task popup. And specify the class to do action. Now go back to task component. Add knockout dependency. Create isVisible property and make it observable. Keep initial value false. Now open task template file. Apply visibility binding to the div element. Specify isVisible observable property as a value to the feedVisible data binding. feedVisible binding toggles the item visibility with transition. Now create div element with class tasks, then child element with class task list, and finally tasks to do. Now create heading element. Under heading, create span element with the text binding. Specify the text to dos. Now open to do layout file. Create display rear node and specify its value task. Now open to do page template file. Create a div element with class task page. Copy to do for each statement and paste it inside task page. Change the origin value to task. We can simplify the inline binding using each element from knockout syntax. In args attribute, we specify the get origin. Keep the render attribute empty. Do same for the to do. Inside get origin, specify to do. Now open abstract component. For task component, we will replace the pop-up object configuration from layout. And now create config node. Create item node with the name PopUp. This will be used to modify the PopUp object. Its XSI type should be an array. Create item node with name element. Open task template file. So for task PopUp element value, we will use view task PopUp ID. Now go back to layout file. Specify element value view task PopUp. Now create item node with the name options and specify XSI type array. Next create item node type and specify its value popup. Then create responsive item type and set its value to true. Change its XSI type to boolean. Now create inner scroll item and specify its XSI type boolean and set its value to true. Next create title item. Specify the title tasks. Next create trigger item. Specify element ID without hash in its value. Next we will create buttons item. It has children, so specify XSI type array. Now we will create cancel button and specify its text close. And finally specify the button class names, action and secondary. Now open to do component. Create is task pop-up visible property and make it observable with false value by default. Next create active to do ID observable property and set 0 as its default value. The purpose of creating both properties is to make them linking properties for task component. We will use them later on. Now open to do template file. We will modify view tasks button. Move the text binding inside the span element. This will simplify our HTML. Now create the click binding and specify view task function. As view task function is being called from loop, so we need to specify $parent operator before it. Open to-do component and create view task function. It should accept the item parameter. Set active to-do ID from current item ID. Then set is task pop-up visible property to true. Now let's link both properties inside task component. Open task component. Create a property active parent ID and let's make it observable with default value 0. Now inside defaults property, create imports linking property. In key specify active parent ID and inside value specify parent scope dot to do and active to do ID from colon. Now whenever changes are made for active to do ID from to do component, the active parent ID property will also be updated. Next we track changes on its task pop-up visible property. Inside task component, create links property right under the default object. The links property is used for cross-tracking properties changes. Both linked properties are tracked and changing of one results in changing the other. Key is name of the internal property or method that sends and receives the notifications. Value is the name of property or method that sends and receives the value. Is visible task internal property. In value is to do internal property. Specify the parent scope path. Dot to do and then specify the property name after column. Then we create listens property and track changes made to the is visible property. In value specify the function on change visibility. Now go ahead and create function on change visibility. It should accept value parameter. If value is set to true, then display the task pop-up. Let's check the output. Reload the to-dos page. The pop-up appears as expected when we click View Tasks button. Now we will override after bind close pop-up function inside the task component. First call the parent logic, then set is visible property to false. This will modify is task pop-up visible property for to-do component as well. Now let's check the changes. The task pop-up is working correctly and does not conflict with the to-do pop-up. Now we need to create the task observable model to hold the data inside. Return knockout observable array. Let's create task sample data here. Specify all items observable except the ID. Parent ID is associated to the item ID. Now open task component and add tasks model dependency. Create task property and assign task instance. Now open task template file. Create unordered list element and specify for each data binding. Then specify task observable property. Under loop create list element. Then create span element and specify text binding. Specify the item title and make sure to add parentheses because it's an observable property. Now let's check the changes. Clicking the view task pop-up displays the list of tasks, but they display for every to-do item. So let's fix that. Open task component and let's apply listens linking property to active parent ID property. In value specify the function underscore set active tasks. Now go ahead and create this function. It should accept a parameter. Before proceeding further, let's create two observable properties. First, pending tasks, and the other is completed tasks. Add underscore dependency. Then inside setActive function, apply filter on tasks using underscore filter function. The first parameter is going to be an object array. In second parameter, specify the function which accepts the task parameter. Compare the task parent ID with the provided ID. This will return all matching items in form of object array. Next, create filter task status function, and it should accept two parameters. First is task object array and second is status integer. Return an empty array if task parameter is not an object or status is undefined. Now apply underscore filter function. Compare the task status with parameter status and return all matching items. Now let's set the pending task property. Inside, call underscore filter task status function and pass filter task and 0 as parameter. This will return all task items with the status value 0. Now do same for completed tasks. This time specify 1 in status value. Now open task template file. Replace task variable with the pending task. Next, create knockout element if, and inside the arguments attribute specify the condition when there are no pending task items. Then display a message. First, create a div with classes, message and success. Then create span element with text binding. Content under if binding renders as soon the condition becomes true. In next line, create if binding and specify conditions. Either pending tasks have items or there are items in completed tasks array. If any of the condition is true, then render the content. Specify the completed task heading. Now let's specify the task counter along with the task heading. Create span element with text binding. Then specify the text concatenated with pending task length counter. Copy the span element and paste against completed tasks heading text. Replace pending task variable with completed tasks. Then create div element with class completed tasks and where visible data binding. Specify completed task length count in value. Before that, let's fix the completed task and pending task by adding parentheses after variable names. Now specify the length property. Create UL element with for each binding and specify the completed tasks variable. Copy the list item containing span element from pending tasks and paste it inside completed tasks. Now create a div element with classes message and info and add fit visible data binding to the element. Specify the exclamation mark before completed task count, so when there are no elements, render the div. Then the div create span element with text binding, which should show a message. Now our next step is to simplify the list item rendering by creating and rendering a child template file. Open task component. Create a new property task list template and specify the template path. Go ahead and create template file. Open task template file. Copy the span element from list item and paste it into newly created template file. Remove the span element. Inside the list element, add knockout render attribute and specify the template path using task list template variable. Copy the variable and replace list item under the completed tasks. Now open layout file. First add task provider. This will be taken as data provider for task component, and it consists of UI component, then add dependency node, and it can be inside or outside the config node. However, practices in Magento recommend to place dapps node inside the config node. Next we will add task form, so first go ahead and add children node. Then create task form node. Create component node and specify UI component. Then we will specify display area, which will allow our form to render on front end. Specify its value task-form. Next create children node. Now create title node, and this is gonna be our UI element. Now specify the abstract component. Then inside the config node, specify the custom scope. This will be used as a data source for element. We have already discussed about in our previous videos when working with the to-do component. Next create template and element template nodes. Next we will specify the provider. Next create data scope and specify its value custom scope value dot title. Specify the field label. Then we can optionally specify the sort order. Create placeholder node and specify its text. Add validations. At first make the field required. Validate the minimum words. And finally specify max text length validation. Open task template file. Under view task pop-up, create a div element. Specify fade visible data binding. In value specify the observable property is form visible. Go ahead and create is form visible property. Open task component. Create is form visible property. Let's specify the default value false. Go back to task template file. Create form element. Next create field set. Specify attribute binding. Create attribute data dash has required. In value specify the text required fields. Now bind the task form using each loop. Specify the display area task dash form. After that, let's create save and cancel buttons. Create attribute binding and specify type button. Next create span element with text binding. Specify the text cancel. Create click binding and specify the anonymous function. Inside this function, we will modify isFormVisible property and set it to false in order to hide the form. We have specified the action directly here because we don't need to overfill the component with functions. Moreover, we needed anonymous function here because click event type should be function, and we needed this property to false only. Next, create save button. Create attribute binding and specify type attribute. Then add click binding and specify save task function. Now let's create this function inside task component. We will come back here later on. Open list template file. Now let's create edit action. This time we will apply click binding on anchor tag. Specify anchor text. Create click binding and specify anonymous function. Specify edit task function, and we need to specify the $parent operator because the rendering content is inside the loop. As we have not created a separate variable this time which can refer the component, so in order to refer the related function inside, we need to pass a component instance as parameter. This refers to the current item in loop. Parent operator refers to the current component instance. Now let's create edit task function inside the task component. Now specify function parameters, task item and the component instance. Set the task data source. Specify all of the task item properties. Set isFormVisible property to true. This will display task form. The task content should be hidden when form is visible. So let's fix that. Go back to task template file. Copy fade visible data binding attribute and paste it inside task div. Add exclamation mark before isFormVisible property. Now open task component and create property task form path. This will be a path to the task form and will be useful for fields validation. So first let's find out path to the task component form. So the path should be km-to-do-scope, then under children node, task, and then task form. Now go back to task component and specify task form path property value. Now let's begin adding the logic inside the save task function. First set params.invalid to false inside data source. On validation failure it will become true. Then we stop further execution. Next get task from data source. Now it is time to validate the form. Since we have only one field to validate, so we will simply call validate form function and pass a path to title UI element as parameter. If validation failed, the params.invalid will become true, so we break further execution in this case. On successful validation, we will proceed further, and the first thing we do is to find the correct index from tasks using task ID. If index is not found, display an alert message and break further function execution. And finally replace the task existing item with updated item using index. We will use an object array to update the modified item values. Finally, set is form visible property to false. This will hide the form and display the task lists again. Next, we will create task subscriptions, which will update pending and completed lists when changes are performed. Call setActiveTask function and specify active parent ID in parameter. So now let's test the changes on front end. Try editing the task. Modify the title. Save it, and we see the changes are reflected. Now test with checking other tasks as well. Try editing other to-do tasks. Task items are updating as expected. So next we are going to create a new task action. Open task template file. Under task list, create a button new task. First create div element with class new task form. Then btn dash toolbar, btn dash group, and then create button element. Create span element with text binding and specify text new task. Now specify button attribute binding. Specify click binding value create new task function. So now go ahead and let's create this function. We directly call edit function with required parameters. Provide task object item in first parameter and specify component instance in second parameter. Let's just create an object array with empty or default value for task item parameter. Title will be an observable item with empty string. Same for the status, but it has integer value. Using value 0, we will mark status pending initially. We will specify active parent ID. Specify current date and time for created and updated properties. Now inside save task function, let's detect if it's newly created task item. Check if task ID is undefined or has empty or 0 value. Inside if statement body, first assign task ID by calculating total tasks and adding 1 to it. This will make the item ID unique. Now it is the time to push task item into task list. From below, copy whole object and paste it under parentheses inside push function. Next, resolve pending and completed task list by calling setActiveTask function and specify active parent ID in parameter. And finally, hide the form by setting its form visible property to false. Break further execution. Now let's simplify the task objects assignment. Create function underscore convert to observables, which should accept task item as parameter. Copy the task object array. Paste and return the object array from convert to observable function. Now replace the whole object with the convert to observable function and pass task as parameter. Do same for the newly created task. And let's do same for create new task function. First make properties value simple. Then pass them as parameter to convert to observables function. Next we will work on task delete action. Open this template file. Duplicate task edit action. And change edit task function to delete task item with same number of parameters. Change the text to delete. Now go ahead and create delete task item function in task component. Specify item as first parameter and component instance second. Apply remove method on task array. Match the deleting task ID with item ID. The matching item will be deleted. Now let's test the changes made so far. Create a new task. Save it. Task has been reflected as expected. Edit newly created item. Modify the title and save it. The item text has been updated. Now try editing existing items. Now create a new task in next to-do item. Try deleting the task item from completed list. This will empty the completed task list. Do same with other items. And all task items have been deleted. Only associated parent items have been removed. Now open list template file. We will add a checkbox to mark task status. Create label element and then add input field inside. Specify attribute binding. Type should be checkbox. In value specify a string task dash and concatenate it with ID. For checked event binding, specify status property for current item. This will be responsible to mark or unmark the checkbox. Next we will add click binding and use anonymous function to update item status. We need this function here because the mark value of checkbox sets as boolean. So we will be setting status value ourselves based on true or false provided value. And finally update statuses by calling setActiveTask function and passing the active parent ID to it. Being under the loop must use the parent operator before calling component function or property. And finally return true to allow the checkbox to perform selection. Move the titles pane under label, so clicking the text should trigger checkbox click event as well. Let's test our changes. As soon as we view the task, we see the checkboxes are working correctly. The click binding is also working fine. Try with creating a new task and mark it complete. Keep testing several scenarios. Now open task component and let's update the task statuses and counters for to-do items as well. Create task statuses observable array property and specify empty array as a default value. We will link this property to a to-do component property later on. For now, navigate to setActiveTask function. In beginning of the function body, reset task statuses value. Now update task status value in the end of function body. Create object array as first item and begin adding useful properties to it. First create parent ID property and specify active parent ID as its value. Then specify total number of tasks for current to-do item. And finally specify number of completed tasks for current to-do item. Now open to-do component. First create task status is observable array property. The default value should be an empty array. Now create import linking property. In key specify task statuses property. In value select task component property task statuses using parent scope. Now let's listen changes made to task statuses property. Now create task statuses listens linking property and listen changes with callback function on task status update. Now go ahead and create on task status update function. It should accept task status object as parameter. First we need to make sure if our target index exists. If it is undefined, then break further execution. Break further execution if any of the property is missing. So we need to make sure all of the properties are there. Simplify the task status. Now find index from to-dos array by providing ID from task status parent ID property. Search using ID key and specify parent ID value from task status property. Next, make sure if index exists for to-dos property. If index is undefined, then stop further processing. Retrieve to-do item using index. Now update the to-do item completed task property. Specify completed task value from task status. Next, update the total task property. Finally, replace the existing to-do item with current to-do object. We have completed both to-do and task components. And now it's the time to test changes. As soon tasks are viewed, we see changes in counts and calculations for related to-do component. Modify and add new changes and observe the to-do status counts. If we keep adding more tasks, total tasks and the progress bar calculations keep on changing. Let's mark every task completed for current item. Then we see the progress bar is 100% and all 6 tasks are done. If we remove all tasks for our to-do item, we see progress bar value 0% and there are no tasks in the list. Now check other items as well. Our front end is almost completed. In our next video, we will work on replacing actions with icons.